important. But I want to get back again to the culture of gun violence and gun use among our youth in particular. In 2008, five youth were killed by youth. And Greg Nichols launched the Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. And what that does is that young men or women who are at risk of violence, either they've already started intersecting with the criminal justice system or they're referred to the program, get additional attention, after school programs. And more than a year ago, we had 400 kids on the waiting list for that. So in our budget, as times got better, we expanded that so that to eliminate the waiting list. And the way that works is it's not government telling the kids how to behave. We all know how that can work as parents even. But what we have is community agencies that do the work. They have the street teams, which are young men and women who have been through this life themselves, who work as mentors for the youth. And what we've seen since then, I almost hesitate to say this, is we have not had a murder committed by anyone in the program or anyone under age 18 since it started. So now we have to expand that, and we put into this year's budget an 18 to 24-year-old program as well. You know, and trying to understand the root causes. And I also mentioned Career Bridge, which is putting together a program for men returning to our community from jail, jobs, education, peer support. There are a lot of factors that can lead young men into taking a gun out with them at night and finding themselves, or during the day, and leading to a tragedy. So those are the things that we're trying to get at the root causes of, as well as things like the gun-free zone.
So I don't have a rebuttal. I agree with what the mayor said, but I wanted to share an insight that I've gained over the years of working with legislators and traveling around the state as a legislator, and that is we have a cultural divide that we in Seattle and people outside Seattle need to work at bridging. And the cultural divide is this. There's sometimes a sense outside of Seattle that we simply want to take away everyone's guns, that we don't understand how they live and their values. And I believe that if we can find a way to talk to each other, we can find a way to actually move things like 594 forward. But it's going to have to take a very different dialogue than we've been engaged in. We have to be sensitive that we don't come across as self-righteous. They have to be, I think, sensitive to stop being so defensive and listen a little bit to what we have to say. I think we can both learn, and I think it's going to be a struggle, because rural Washington and suburban Washington and urban Washington are really three different cultures and how they approach this issue.
If this is partly a mental health problem, what are your ideas using the office of mayor to address the problem from that viewpoint? Now again? Pardon? Oh my goodness. All right. If this is partly a mental health problem, what are your ideas using the office of mayor to address the problem from that viewpoint?
Yeah. Well, that's good. And we're getting at multiple pieces to this, right? We're talking about what are the rules as to who can buy or sell guns and how one can obtain a gun legally, and trying to close all the loopholes. We've spoken some here about youth violence. There's issue of gun ownership in the home and responsible ownership and the rest. Mental health is another piece of it. So I'm sure we're going to touch all of the pieces. You know, the reality is that over the last decades, we've support for those in mental distress, mental health distress, has declined dramatically. This state, by the way, is 50th in the nation on mental health beds. And we feel that here on our streets. Our chief pugil has gone to Olympia, to talk about what this issue is. And it's not a new issue. We saw it very recently. We've seen it in this in the last few years. The Cafe Racer shootings. In fact, we were here when we announced the gun buyback program with the owner of Cafe Racer as well. With the horrible murders on the individual walking home from the Sounders game. My friend Shannon Harps, who is a organizer within the Sierra Club, was killed on Capitol Hill coming back to her house on New Year's Eve after going shopping, preparing for a party. So the rules for involuntary civil commitment are high. There are reasons for that. The resources to treat people or to move them into a commitment are high. And so we have worked to train our police officers better on dealing with those in distress. We've hired mental health professionals for the police department to provide greater support. We have worked to add, and we are going to work to add, we're just having this dialogue recently of working to add a program where we put some dollars in and work with our social service providers and others and the police to identify people who may not meet the level for involuntary commitment but clearly need help. And I don't want to stigmatize people with mental health issues. The vast majority of people deal with it fine, but there's a small number who don't have family, friends, neighbors, or health care, who destabilize on our streets, and we have to have a faster response to them and surround them with more attention.
Senator Murray.
Thank you.
Is it on?
Is it on? No. I have no idea how to turn it on.
Well, why don't we use the other one?
Thank you. So you had asked us to be forward-looking, so I'll leave it to you all to talk about, to your own Democratic state legislators, about the mental health funding. So looking forward, we did several things this year in regards to mental health in Olympia. Number one is we wrote a law that's going to revamp our mental health system. We've changed too much and we know it's outdated. And that was a bipartisan effort between Senator Darnell and Senator, he just passed away, Mike Carroll. So that's going to be important. Secondly, we put, for the first time in many years, some significant dollars in mental health funding. Third, we had quite the battle, and I would encourage you all to look at the video, to pass the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act in Washington State. But we did it, and Republicans, a group of Republicans, mostly from the east side of King County, supported us. And as a result of that, people today are going to, well, not today, but when it goes into effect, will not only be entitled to health insurance, but health insurance that includes mental health insurance. That's going to make a huge difference to a lot of populations, including people out on the streets, access that they haven't had before. Other parts of the Affordable Care Act deal with the competitive grants and pilot projects. We as a city need to be really, really organized to compete for those, to get those, because I think we can create some cutting edge models here, because mental health is really one aspect of it. But I do have to say this, as we discussed and debated gun issues in Olympia, I was reminded again and again and again by mental health advocates, please do not consider mental health illness and gun problems as the same issue. Sometimes they are, but the mental health community feels very strongly that not every person with a mental illness should be viewed as a potential, someone who will potentially use a gun.
Thank you. Mayor McGinn.
Yeah, the adoption of the Affordable Care Act is great, and we've put additional dollars in our city budget to sign people up for it, and it does mean we're going to reach a lot more people. It doesn't actually add any more mental health beds. That is something that we will need more help with. But again, to explain a little more about the program we're talking about, trying to start here in Seattle, we did something called the Center City Roundtable to try to talk about how do we deal with crime and disorder issues on Seattle streets. And it was, as opposed to the panhandling legislation, which was very divisive, we actually got the social service advocates, the business owners, the residents, and the relevant agencies all to the table to start talking about what are solutions. And what starts coming out of that is there are different solutions for different issues. And the issue of individuals on our streets who are, decompensated, who aren't receiving mental health treatment is one of them. And again, we talked about, well, we need to start identifying a local funding source, a local program, local providers, so that again we can give more attention to individuals that we identify on the streets, our police officers or our social service agencies, the people we identify on the streets who are clearly in distress, but we cannot reasonably expect that they will be getting mental health treatment and or involuntarily committed. We've got to figure out how to deal with these individuals in crisis, and that's the next step that we're going to be working on through our Center City Roundtable.
Thank you. Senator Murray, do you think gun violence is a public health problem? If so, what can you as mayor do to address it from this viewpoint?
Well, thank you. First, since the issue of us being number 50 in the state has come up twice, I guess we do have to go just a little bit off the positive here. Let me read you a letter that the mayor sent me and my colleagues in 2011, which was a year of terrible economic times for the state. He said, the Seattle delegation did an excellent job of helping to preserve as much of the safety net as possible, while at the same time advancing many of the city's top priorities. The issue of beds is one issue, but the issue we're trying to get at with the Affordable Care Act and with revising our own state's approach to mental health is not beds, it's prevention, it's upfront. It's a paradigm shift in how we're going to try and address this. But again, I'll let you all talk to your own Democratic legislators. It is a public health problem, and it can be addressed through the Seattle-King County Public Health Department, through some of the programs that already exist, through state funding and federal funding. There's usually matching programs sometimes that have not been pursued that should be actively pursued. But it is an incredible opportunity, I think, going forward, again, to use the dollars that are about to come to us into our healthcare system and direct those through the Seattle-King County Mental Health Department to address gun responsibility, I'm trying to get the language down, as a public health crisis.
Thank you.
You're going to have to give me a copy of that letter. It turns out I'm a pretty nice guy after all. The question, there is a law enforcement component to gun violence, which is important, but it is at heart a public health issue, I believe. So I want to talk just a minute or two about the law enforcement side. We did partner with the federal government to have, with the federal prosecutors, to have stiffer penalties, federal penalties for people who were using guns and were violent, using guns in the city. We had gun sting operations, the fake pawn shop operation where we identified people who were trading in guns. In fact, the trade in guns, as well as unfortunately the trade in young women and the trade in drugs, is what fuels a lot of gang profits and gang violence as well. So there is a law enforcement side, but again, I believe at heart it's a public health issue where you have to look at, what are the causes, how does it spread, how do you get to those that are spreading this, and that's where the Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative comes in, that's where Career Bridge comes in, that's where our gun-free zones in businesses come in. We're going to partner with Ceasefire on Asking Saves Lives, which is a program if you're a parent to ask where your kids go, ask those parents, do they have a gun in the house and how do they deal with it. All of those things, like with smoking, for example, or like ticketing, click it or ticket, using your seatbelt, all of those are ways that you change attitudes around what is a very serious public health issue. And we can do that with or without new regulations. We're going to push for those, but changing that attitude and trying to get at a harm reduction policy and a public health policy with this, I think is something that will yield benefits if we maintain a sustained effort at it.
Thank you. Okay. Children are often the unintended victims of gun violence. And according to the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, an average of 8 children under 20 die of gun violence every day in the U.S. Do you have specific ideas on how to reduce this kind of gun violence? And a little hint, should there be liability for the gun owner when a child misuses a gun? All right.
Well, some of the simple things we've talked about, Al Gore's lockbox. Now we need that lockbox in every home that has a gun that has children. Actually, in every home that has a gun, even if they don't have children, because children may visit any home. What was the last part of the question?
Should there be liability for the gun owner?
There should be liability for the gun owner, both civil liability and criminal liability for the gun owner. This is, one of the most tragic things you see and read about is kids who are playing with guns in a house after school and somebody is injured seriously or killed. And so that's one of the things we can do. We can also increase the education around gun violence. One of the other bills that we were able to pass a few years that relates to this somewhat is the issue of school safety, the anti-bullying bill. That we have programs like that in place where we're actually teaching kids how to treat each other And I think that leads to other behaviors as when they get a gun, if they're angry. It's very important that if kids understand that if they have disagreements, beating each other up or shooting each other is not an answer. So that law, I think, was pretty significant.
Could you repeat the question for me? I'm sorry.
8 children under 20 die of gun violence every day in the U.S. How would you specifically, what are your specific ideas on stopping this, reducing it? And should there be liability for the gun owner when a child misuses a gun?
Yeah, so auto accidents, gun deaths, drownings, I think those are the top 3 issues that affect kids, leading cause of death. And, so we've worked on safe routes to schools. We have lifeguards at all our beaches, never cut them, and kept our pools open for instruction. We're surrounded by water. Every kid should learn to swim. And I think we need to think about guns in the same way, that being around guns is inherently dangerous for kids. So we were talking about gun safety, and I was also talking about the Asking Saves Lives program, where if we can change the culture of parents and the peer pressure of parents upon other parents, that it's really not okay to have a gun in the house, and particularly an unsecured gun in the house, that will do a lot to save lives. Just like making sure we have lifeguards on the beach, just like making sure we invest in safe crosswalks for our kids and ticket speeders outside of schools. So I think that these are, and this is why when you asked earlier about a public health issue, that's why I think it is at heart a public health issue, and we should treat it that way. I actually haven't contemplated the question before of whether there should be liability for a parent, but I can see the logic behind pushing that, and would love to participate in a discussion about where would liability lie for a parent who did not secure their gun or did not properly supervise their kids. I think that could be a very strong expression of that set of values that we're just talking about. You have to secure it. If you don't, you could be liable. I'm talking myself into it right here, and I haven't thought about it before. I can see exactly why this would be something to put out there, set a new standard of liability which reflects our society's standard of what's appropriate behavior. Yeah, I'd be happy to engage in that discussion and work with others on how we could craft an effort to try to create that standard of liability.
Good. Actually, a number of states do have such liability.
Yeah. Well, then it makes sense to see how they define it, how it works, and take a look at using it here. Absolutely.
So in the interest of getting to your questions, we basically agreed on that one. I'm not going to give a rebuttal.